For the first time since the end of World War II, Japanese forces will fight overseas. Japan has passed a controversial law changing the largely self-defense status of its military. What will this mean for Japan and its neighbours? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. Now, when the Second World War ended, Allied forces made it a condition of surrender for Japan to have a military that's only limited to self-defense. Well, 70 years later, Japan says it needs a stronger military. It's passed a new law that could lead to its forces being deployed abroad. Well, the issue has sparked protests and debate. Backers of the legislation argue Japan's backyard has become a dangerous place. Missile tests in North Korea, Chinese challenges to Japanese claims to remote islands. But opponents say the conditions are too vague and give future governments too much leeway for interpretation. The government of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe wants Japan's military to deploy overseas when the following three conditions are met. If Japan or a close ally is attacked and the result threatens its survival and poses a clear danger, if there is no other appropriate way to stop the attack and ensure Japan's survival and protect its people, and if the force used is restricted to a necessary minimum. We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first Rob McBride has this from Tokyo.
After this historic vote, Japan is coming to terms with potentially its new role in the world. More engaged with an assertive military to match that makes many here uncomfortable.
I'm infuriated. We have a constitution that renounces war, and it's been undermined.
It's a hard decision. Volunteering troops to go overseas is different from just defending ourselves.
The security situation around the world is changing. That's why this is necessary.
This controversial legislation will change how Japan's self-defense forces are allowed to operate overseas, from being purely a defensive force. It's a move Prime Minister Shinzo Abe says is long overdue.
This peace security bill is necessary to protect people's life and peace and to prevent war. I understand we have managed to install the legal foundation necessary for our children in the future generation, and for their peace.
The vote came after a marathon session in both houses of Japan's parliament. Opposition parties inside and the thousands of protesters outside have promised to fight the legislation in the courts and at the next election.
Pacifism is not dead in Japan. We've seen millions of people on the streets over the last few months demonstrating exactly how attached to the Constitution and pacifism Japanese people are.
While the US welcomes this change, China has condemned what it sees as an aggressive gesture, coming so soon after ceremonies marking the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. Japan's pacifist constitution was a direct result of its role in that war, which makes it a divisive issue for many Japanese. For many people, it is the symbolism of what this change will mean. The purity of the pacifism Japan has followed for the past 70 years, now tarnished. The country set on a new course, wherever that now leads. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera, Tokyo.
Well, time to bring our guests in now. In Tokyo, we have Tomohiko Taniguchi, Special Advisor to the Cabinet of Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. And in Beijing, Jie Shudong, Senior Research Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome to both of you. If I could start with Mr. Tomohiko in Tokyo. No country is threatening to invade Japan right now or one of its allies. Why did the Prime Minister feel that these bills needed to pass right now?
Clearly, Japan is not going to be able to exercise its offense capacities. The first defense-first policy that Japan has continued to cherish over the last 70 years is going to remain intact. As you specified at the beginning of the show, by introducing three principles, Japan's armed forces are going to be motivated only when either Japan itself is under attack or its close alliance partner is under attack. And that situation should cause tremendous danger and imminent threat to Japan. So those are strict restrictions that Japan is going to continue to embrace. So it's not that the Japanese are now able to act as if they are like Americans, Australians, Canadians, or the British.
All right, but my question was, why did the Prime Minister feel the need now? There is no country that's threatening to invade Japan right now, is there?
There are actually two noticeable developments over the last 10 years or so, if I may say. One is that the security situation in the region is rapidly changing. The rise of China, the North Korean nuclear ambition, and so on and so forth, you name it. South China Sea particularly has become a sea of contention. And the United States is changing its gear from what was called a hub and spokes shaped alliance to a networked alliance in which the alliance partners such as South Korea, Japan, Australia, and Singapore and Thailand are supposed to play their due roles respectively. And I don't want my country to become and continue to be the weakest link of such a chain.
Okay, let's take the point then to Beijing. Jia, I don't want my country to be the weakest link in the chain, says Mr. Tomohiko. That's not an unreasonable demand, is it? I mean, most countries reserve the right to military operations overseas under certain conditions. Why is it a problem if Japan becomes one of them?
Right. At this moment, no country is threatening Japan to invade Japan or engage in any action that threatens Japanese security. And the rise of China is often cited as one of the reasons for Japan to change its defense policy. That's just an excuse because since the end of the Second World War, China and Japan have never engaged in any military confrontation or conflict. Even there is no friction between China and Japan in any military sense. And so far, China stands for peaceful and dialogue with Japan over only one territorial dispute, that is the Diaoyu Island. And China does not seek a military solution to that. Also, China has stand
but
for...
hang on, Mr. Jia, if you don't mind, allow me to interrupt you as I did Mr. Tomohiko. Forgive me, but Mr. Tomohiko made it clear, though, in his perspective, there has been friction in the South China Sea, hasn't it? Hasn't China been playing a more assertive role with its military, widening the scope of its aerial patrols, widening some of the little islands, turning them into bases, military bases? Do you not see that might upset Tokyo and make it worried?
That's another excuse Japan has adopted for its shift in its pacifist posture. And actually, Japan is not a party to the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. And there is no confrontation right now in the South China Sea. And China stands for dialogue to settle this. And but Japan tried to make a fuss over the dispute, over the issue, to justify its change of its security policy. It's one of the excuses it uses for that purpose.
Who will interpret when it becomes necessary to defend an ally? Who interprets when all other options have been exhausted, or what the minimum use of force is? Doesn't this law give a lot of interpretive leeway to the government?
Japan is a parliamentary democracy, and it's a well-established parliamentary democracy. If the voters in Japan are not satisfied or even angry about decisions taken by the current administration of Shinzo Abe, there is going to be ample opportunities down the road for them to exercise their voting power. So that's the first bottom line of checks and balances. In addition to that, the cabinet has made it clear that parliamentary debate ought to be taking place, and Parliament should get involved in the decision-making process when the bills are going to be implemented.
How do you respond to those who say parliamentary oversight will not be effective because the government controls both houses of the parliament?
That's why I am saying that the Japanese election calendar is actually very, very short. Next year, the upper house is going to have its own elections, and you will see how much opposition is going to be voiced against Shinzo Abe's administration. And let me just go back to what my colleague from Beijing said. The South China Sea situation is not something remote to Japan. Japan is a sea-dependent nation, and the freedom of navigation and the getting faithful to the accepted international norm make up one of the most important assets for Japan and for other sea-dependent nations, namely almost all Asian countries.
All right. If we can go to Mr. Xu Dong then in Beijing. How do you see Japan's future foreign military role changing as a result of these bills which have been passed? Do you think, for example, that this will lead to more friction, military friction even, between Beijing and Tokyo?
Japan actually is inviting an uncertain future for itself with this shift, the biggest shift in its security and military policy. And actually there has been debate in Japan about the legislation, security legislation bills. The debate will actually accompany Japan in the future. Whenever there is any event that may get Japan involved, and the legislation already has split the Japanese society, and it's very divisive. In the future, they will also remain divisive, and not only the people in Japan will debate what role Japan will play, the international community will also question Japan's role in the future. For example, because Japan is an ally of the United States, the U.S. will ask more from Japan to support U.S. foreign policy, to support the goals of U.S. international strategy. And for example, in the future, the United States may ask Japan to deploy troops to fight along with the United States in wars like those in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in many other international disputes. And the people in Japan, the people in the world will question what role will Japan play. The key point is that because Japan has not reconciled with its neighbors, especially China and South Korea, and there are political forces in Japan which are very strong that they deny their aggression. You know, they even said that they try to reinterpret the term of aggression.
All right,
and
Mr. Xu Dong, you've mentioned a range of really important points there. I want to take them so we don't get too far ahead of ourselves. Let me go back to Mr. Taniguchi. And one point which Mr. Xu Dong raised there is a really interesting one that has resonated with domestic audiences. The chances that Japan may be dragged into other conflicts, US-led conflicts, as a result of these bills.
If you call that kind of situation what occurred to other freedom-loving, human rights-loving nations, ranging from Britain, Australia, Canada, and so on and so forth, and then you call all those nations warmongering or revisionist of any sort, then the argument may make sense. My point is, Japan is going to pursue its own national security based on its own calculations. And the conditions that you introduced at the beginning of the show are going to remain intact. So the Japanese will react only when they are under attack in the first place, or for the first time in its post-war history, you are right, it's going to activate its armed forces when its alliance partner is under attack, only when the situation thereof should cause imminent threat to Japan.
All right. As Mr. Taniguchi said there...
Actually, may I say something about
Okay,
this?
please go ahead.
Actually, Japan doesn't have an independent foreign policy or even security policy. It is an ally of the United States. Actually, the United States will not allow Japan to have an independent, truly independent military and security policy, because if Japan adopts an independent foreign policy or security policy, that will maybe a challenge, even a threat to the security of the United States. So Japan will have to support the U.S. foreign policy. That is, a dilemma for Japan. It tries to be independent. However, with this new legislation in place, actually it will be banded onto the dragon, the wagon of the U.S. foreign policy and military strategy.
Mr. Shudong, how do you respond to those who would say, though, it's not just the United States, a number of other countries, even in the region, the Philippines, Australia, they've been keen for Japan to expand its military role in what they see as the need for a counterbalance to Chinese influence in the South China Sea. As Mr. Taniguchi said, they are a sea-dependent nation. Is Japan really a threat to the South China Sea or an expanded military role, or is it something that would provide security for many other countries in the area?
Of course, different countries may have different attitudes towards Japan's shift in the security policy. For example, the United States welcomes and encourages Japan to take that move. But for China, actually, China is not concerned about any future invasion of China again by Japan, because China will make sure that never again will Japan be able to invade China as it did during the Second World War and before that. However, with this new legislation, that will make the situation in the region more complex. For example, Japan may not be able to resist the temptation to get involved in regional disputes and to, for example, in the South China Sea, and may encourage some countries like the Philippines to take even a stand that is maybe contrary to the trend of seeking a peaceful solution to the disputes. That is the concern why this legislation may get the situation in the region more complicated.
Okay, Mr. Taniguchi, will there be a move towards more militarization? I think one of the points that we're hearing from Mr. Shudong there. I mean, perhaps more of an increase in military spending, expansion of the armed forces, procurement or development of new types of weapons. Once a nation starts down this path, it doesn't usually end, does it?
Well, under the NATO standard, a participating nation is supposed to spend at least 2% as opposed to its GDP for defense purposes. I think Japan has been spending too little, 1% as opposed to its GDP. And there may be some in Japan and outside of Japan that wish that Japan should spend more on defense purposes. But the Japanese budgetary situation, dire, and its population aging, so it's very much transparent from outside to see what's occurring, what amount of money Japan can spend, and the Japanese budgetary situation is very much easily observable. If you are so concerned as to Japan's so-called possibility to rearm itself, then you could see what's going to happen in the annual budgeting process, and that's the only thing that you could say, you could do.
One interesting article I read in one of the Chinese publications, Mr. Xu Dong, was the possibility of popular opposition to Mr. Shinzo Abe, perhaps prompting him or forcing him to have to step down as his grandfather once did. Is that what countries like Beijing are counting on, that this, what you see perhaps as militarization, can be reversed through domestic opposition?
Well, you know, there is a growing trend in Japan of historical revisionism, that is, the denial of Japan's aggression in the Second World War and before that, and Japan's colonization of Asia, and even the history of Japan of sex slavery. And, we really understand the wish of many people in Japan for a strong Japan and for a bigger role of Japan in international affairs. However, with this growing trend of historical revisionism and a move away from the pacifist constitution, people have the reason to question where is Japan is moving from here. And Japan actually, since the end of the war, in the past few decades, Japan has enjoyed an image of a pacifist nation, which has contributed a lot to the international community, right, including this contribution to China's development and economic growth. However, this kind of legislation will make people question whether Japan will continue with its peaceful development. When will it get involved in international disputes led by the United States? That is a question that will, make people question the future role of Japan, the future path Japan will adopt.
Okay, let's take that question then to Mr. Taniguchi. How much of a threat to Mr. Shinzo Abe do you think the domestic opposition is, the protests and the scenes we've seen in Parliament?
Once again, it's going to be a testing period, certainly for Shinzo Abe, because next year he's going to be tested and checked by the voters themselves. So he has to do a lot to deliver on many other issues in order for him to win credibility over the upcoming upper house elections. That said, seen from Japan's perspective, so long as the country is democracy, so long as the country is freedom-loving nation, so long as it is a seed-dependent, trade-dependent nation, there aren't many options available for Japan except for the country to anchor itself more firmly with like-minded, sea-going democracies such as the United States, Australia, Singapore, India, and you name it. And that's the only way now and for the future for Japan to choose. And I think the security bills now that passed the parliament are going to strengthen that connection that Japan needs to have now and in the future.
A brief point then. I'm wondering, Mr. Taniguchi, how much were economic considerations a part of Mr. Shinzo Abe's thinking in trying to pass these bills?
Very little, if I may say, because national security is itself the most important public goods that the government has to take care of. That said, I think Japan's economy must be revitalized very much for many purposes. First of all, for bread and butter purpose, and for Japan to maintain its due role in the international community.
Right.
So economy is important, but for him, these bills are separate from those concerns.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Let's thank our guests, Mr. Taniguchi in Tokyo and Mr. Xu Dong in Beijing. And thank you too for watching. You can contact us by going over to our program page on our website, aljazeera.com. You can also leave a comment on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zaidan, and the whole team for now, it's goodbye.